Welcome back. So you may notice we're skipping around the book a little bit, right? So we're not progressing. We started out in the beginning of the text, and now I'm jumping ahead to the chapters on utilitarianism because just the structure of this course and the fact that it's a summer course and moves very quickly. In order to write your paper, you probably are going to, or even think of your idea. It's going to be a good idea to know a bit about two of the two most important moral theories that we're going to look at, ethical theories, utilitarianism and deontology. Because even if your paper topic ends up not having much to do with utilitarianism or deontology directly, you'll often find that it comes back around. Utilitarian considerations, deontological considerations seem to always play a part, right, in ethical theorizing. Now, you may not know right now what I mean by utilitarian considerations or deontological considerations. You'll find out about these in the next 2 weeks, but this is why I'm skipping ahead, right? I want to sort of foreground these two kind of most important ethical theories. So to begin to talk about utilitarianism, or sort of what it is and why we should believe it, I think it's helpful to think about two types of what we call normativity. So a normative statement, you can contrast it with a descriptive statement. Much of what you learn at this university are descriptive statements about the way the world is, right? So when you learn that the acceleration of gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared, that's just describing the world, right? It's an interesting fact, right? It's an important fact about the world, but just a fact about the world nonetheless, right? What we're doing in this class is trying to figure out what are the true normative statements, or a particular subset of the true normative statements about the world. And normative statements are statements about how things should be, right? Or what we should do, not about necessarily how they are now, right? So there's kind of two ways that you engage in normative statements, right? And normativity in the world. Anytime you ask, should I do X, right? Sorry to pause for a loud truck. A lot of the time when we ask, like, should I do X, right? We're asking it in the context of trying to achieve some particular goal, right? So one type of should statement that you might hear uttered is if you say, oh, what's the quickest way to get to UCSD, right? And someone might say, oh, well, if you want to get to UCSD quickly, you should take Genesee, or something like that, right? This is what we would call sort of an instrumental form of normativity. It furthers a particular end, right? But it's not the sort of should statement we're concerned with when we're thinking about ethics, right? It doesn't carry a lot of ethical weight if you take Genesee versus taking some other road, right? So where ethical normativity, those sorts of normative statements come in, tends to be towards the end, the ultimate end of these various should statements, right? In the most general sense, what are we all aiming at, right? What should we be doing? What is our ultimate goal? These are going to be ethical questions. So this handsome fella is John Stuart Mill. He was hanging around in the 1800s, and he's sort of the most significant figure associated with utilitarianism. You're going to be reading a piece of his, right, on what is utilitarianism. And in that piece, he gives a very brief argument for why we should believe in utilitarianism. And so here I'm kind of expanding on that in a way that hopefully will make a bit more sense to you, right? So back to these instrumental should statements, right? If you want to get to campus quickly, you should take Genesee, right? If you want to get to an ethical statement, you can just keep asking why, right? Like a 5-year-old does. You might say, well, why do I want to get to campus? Why should I get to campus quickly, right? And depending on the situation, the answer might be, you should get to campus quickly, right? If you want to make it to your final on time. Well, why should I make it? Why should I want to make it to my final on time? Well, in order to get a good grade. Why do I want to get a good grade, right? Why should I get a good grade? To graduate with a good GPA. Why should I graduate with a good GPA? To get a good job. Why should I get a good job? To make enough money to pay for food and housing. Why should I make enough money to pay for food and housing? Because if you don't, you might be hungry and live on the street. why shouldn't I be hungry and live on the street? It hurts, right? Being hungry hurts, right? You're cold, you're tired. If you're living on the street, right, it's possible you get mugged or attacked. That can also hurt. So the idea, if you're a utilitarian, right, and this is implicit in what Mill says when he says something like the ultimate end of everything is pain, is the absence of pain, right, and the attainment of pleasure. He's saying everything we do, in the end, if you keep asking why, it's to avoid pain and to produce pleasure. That's why we do everything. That is the ultimate end. So this gives pain and pleasure, for Mill, an ethical weight, right? It's in the most general sense when you ask, what should we do? What is our aim? The aim is avoid pain, try to experience pleasure. So this slide is, largely repeating what I just said, right? So again, when you keep asking, why should I? Mill thinks it's always going to stop at it hurts or it feels good, right? Why are you eating that donut instead of, right, drinking Soylent? It tastes good. It feels good, right, to eat a donut, right? Uh, why do you play chess, or why do you do any of the sort of recreational activities you do? It feels good, right? It makes me feel good. It makes me happy, and being happy feels good, right? So utilitarians, right, say that the ultimate end, the ultimate good is pleasure, the ultimate evil is pain. And that's the reason we do all this other stuff, like get up early and drive to class. So this sort of viewpoint, if we want to use a little more technical language, a utilitarian is a hedonistic act consequentialist, right? So what does all that mean? So the act part means that when you're judging what is right and wrong, what is morally good and evil in this world, you're talking about actions, right? Things like, right, killing, giving money to charity, all these are actions, right? So the sort of thing that we want to judge, right, when we're judging things ethically is an action. And then they're consequentialists because they think that those actions are judged right or wrong in virtue of their consequences, right? What does that action lead to eventually? And the consequences they care about, the hedonistic part, is they think the relevant consequences are pleasure and pain, right? So that's hedonism, pleasure, right? So they're hedonistic act consequentialists. And important point, we're not just talking about, oh, you should do whatever is pleasurable for you and attempt to reduce pain just for you and not care about anyone else. That would be sort of a very simplistic version, and it wouldn't hold up under much scrutiny, right? What the utilitarians say is, no, 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 we mean total pleasure and pain for everyone in the universe, right? The end to which we are all striving is to maximize the pleasure of the whole world, right, and minimize the pain of the whole world. So you can't just go around, right, killing people and taking their money if that somehow makes you feel good, right? No, you have to take into consideration their pain and their pleasure as well, right? When you're asking, should I do this, right, for any action. So, for example, maybe you're wondering, should I steal this shirt from H&M, right? Now, normally, probably until you took this course, you thought, well, my parents told me stealing is wrong, it's against the law, right? I could get in trouble. No, right? I shouldn't do it. Now, the only part of that the utilitarian would actually care about is the I could get in trouble part. That part is a possible consequence of your action, right? When you're asking, should I steal, they don't care about any sort of moral rules about what your parents told you is wrong or whatever, right? They ultimately care about, well, what will the consequences be? How much pain and pleasure will it create, right? And what you have to do is add all that stuff up to decide whether it's right or wrong. And it's really often an open question whether it's right or wrong, right? So let's try it. You steal the shirt from H&M. Well, why did you want to steal it? It'll cost you, you'll get some pleasure out of that. You like the shirt, right? You'll feel good wearing it, right? And maybe You'll look so good wearing it that you'll attract that person you've had a crush on, and that will lead to more pleasure, or something like that, right? What's in the cons, right? What possible pain could it cause? Well, you could get caught and fined, or sent to jail or something. That would cause you some pain. And obviously, the person you're stealing from, that would cause them some pain as well. Now, given that you're stealing from a big corporation, right, that makes tons of money and may not ever even notice that a shirt is missing, right? The amount of pain might not be that much, right? Now, what about the person, right, who's sort of in charge of making sure the shirts didn't get stolen? If they did find out, would they fire that person, right? Would that cause them some pain, possibly? You have to think about all this stuff, right? And you can already figure out that it's sort of impossible to know for sure what's going to happen, right? You have to make your best guess about the possible consequences, add them up and weigh them up, right? But it could turn out in this example, right, if the company's so big that no one would ever notice the shirt is missing, right? And if you're very unlikely to get caught, or even if you do get caught, at worst, they'll just say, hey, get out of here, give us the shirt back, right? It'll maybe cause a little pain of embarrassment for a moment. And the upside is you get this nice shirt, right? And you have a great time with it. Maybe you should steal the shirt, right? That's a possible, right, answer that utilitarianism could give you, depending, again, on how the consequences shake out. So a little more about consequences. So again, the utilitarian thinks that the relevant consequences are pain and pleasure, right? They think those are at the end of the line, those are the consequences that we really care about, right, in the end. That's not the only kind of consequentialist you could be, right? There's lots of other consequences, and maybe you think there's other ones that are more important than pain and pleasure. So sometimes preference satisfaction, right, is used instead. So, maybe I have certain preferences, right? Things I would like out of life. And maybe those things aren't going to cause a ton of pleasure, and they might even cause a little pain, right? Maybe I want to, I don't know, solve some mathematical theorem, right? And that's my preference. That's what I want to do with my life, even though it's a really hard struggle. And I get a certain amount of satisfaction, but it's so much pain too. And then I'm just the sort of type of personality that once I've solved it, I don't really even get a big buzz out of it, and I'm on to the next thing or whatever, right? It might turn out, right, that on net that's actually more painful. But if that's my preference, right, and I'm that kind of consequentialist, then that's the relevant consequence, right? So that's not what the utilitarians think, but that's what some other sorts of consequentialists think, right? Another sort of consequentialism that we'll get into is what you call rule consequentialism, right? So that says no, we don't want to sort of do the math for every single action and see how much pain and pleasure it causes. Instead, we want to think about sort of general rules. Does stealing in general, right, if everybody did it, would that cause more pain or more pleasure, right? And if it causes more pleasure, then we should follow that rule. Cause more pain, we should say don't steal, right? So there's lots of, again, different ways, different consequences you should care about. But the utilitarians care about pleasure and pain, right? Action by action. Now, there's no doubt that we care about consequences, right? And this is often how we think when we're doing moral reasoning, right? So, and you can see it in our legal system as well. So, attempted murder gets a much lower sentence than murder, right? Your intention was the same. You were trying to murder someone, but it's all about the consequences, right? When you stab them, did they die or did they not, right? If they died, you're going to get a harsher sentence. We generally say that's a much worse thing than if you stab somebody and they lived, right? That might seem a little weird from a certain viewpoint. We'll see another viewpoint, deontology, sort of the exact opposite. They only care about intentions, right? But it's no doubt that we care about consequences, right? When we're thinking about morality, and utilitarianism totally focuses in on that. And they say consequences are all that matters. So utilitarianism was a pretty revolutionary, pretty progressive sort of moral theory at the time. Again, this was, in the 19th century. Prior to that, most ethical thinking happened within the context of religion, right? And in the West, in particular, and this is the tradition that Mill's coming out of, the Christian religion, right? The idea was, look, God created the universe with a purpose, And so when you want to know what should we do, that's up to God. You ask what is God's plan, right? And ask your priest or your Bible, or do a little reasoning yourself to figure out what would God want, right? But in the context of the Enlightenment, right, and the scientific revolution, gradually we got to where we are now, where more and more, right, sort of ethical thinking, legal thinking, right, church and state, they're becoming separate, right? And we're starting to think about ethics independently of religion, right? So at the time, it was J.S. Mill and then Jeremy Bentham as well. And they were doing all kinds of interesting things, right? Because there's all sorts of interesting consequences, right? About like imprisonment and punishment, right? And retribution. So if you're a consequentialist, right, and someone breaks the law, should we punish them? What would be the reason for it? It's slightly different than sort of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth sort of thing, right? You say, well, what good would come of punishing this person? Certainly it would cause them pain, right? So even if they did a bad thing, for a utilitarian, it's not obvious that the answer, right, the right response, the morally right response is just cause more pain, right, to the person that caused the pain in the first place. There has to be some, if you're going to imprison someone or punish them, there has to be some pleasure that comes out of it too, and there probably is, right? You might want to lock them up to prevent the future pain that they will cause more people, right? There's other reasons, but the process, the logic behind things is very different. So if you're trying to apply utilitarianism to sort of to society, right, you end up with different values and a very different sort of like thinking about justice and how we run a right society. So Rachel's offers a few sort of examples that kind of motivate utilitarianism, or just sort of like help you help you understand sort of how it applies to specific cases, right? And many of these cases are meant to say, at the end, you're meant to think utilitarianism kind of gets it right here, right? Whereas other moral theories seems like intuitively like they give us the wrong answer, right? And again, our intuitions in ethics, they count, right? This is a methodology that I haven't maybe gotten into in so much detail, but a lot of what we'll be doing here is describing certain cases, right? Take our different moral theories and say, well, this moral theory says we should do X, this moral theory says we should do Y in this situation, and then you kind of ask your gut, right? So often will feel very obvious, like, whoa, theory X, that's a wacky answer from theory X. Like, no one would do that ever, right? And that tends to be evidence against theory X, right? You're just sort of gut feeling that, like, ugh, that's the wrong answer in that situation. So it's not so strange. We do similar things in linguistics and what we call conceptual analysis, right? As sort of like competent members of the culture that speak the language, share the same concepts of good and evil with everyone else, we can largely trust that we largely agree on these specific cases, and that can be used as evidence for, what our shared concept of good and evil are. And is it a utilitarian sort of concept, or is it deontological or something else? And again, I'm using this big word deontology. I haven't explained it yet. It'll be in the next week, right? But just for now, it's another kind of theory. Right? Okay, so again, point being, we're going to describe the situation. Think to yourself, is utilitarianism intuitively getting the right answer in this case, right? So euthanasia, right? So this is sort of the assisted suicide or the killing of someone, typically at the end of their life when they're very ill or in a lot of pain, right? So Sigmund Freud, right, the famous psychoanalyst, the sort of inventor of psychoanalysis, right? He was in one of these situations at the end of his life. He had terminal bone cancer, which is, if you know anything about it, it's incredibly painful. Any movement really is just excruciating pain. So he was in constant pain. His body was basically sort of decaying and rotting. So he sort of gave off this terrible smell. It was very difficult for anyone to be around him. So it was hard for him to have any friendship or companionship at the time. Even his dog didn't really want to be around him. He had to sleep in a tent to keep the flies off of him. So it was a very sort of degraded, right, physical situation here. So Freud did not want to live anymore, right? He knew he was going to die anyways, and his existence was painful, both physically and emotionally. So he asked a fellow physician, Max Schur, to help him die. And that physician obliged, gave him an injection, and that ended Freud's life. Now, according to traditional sort of Christian ethics or sort of rule-based ethics, and again, the deontology that I keep referring to, we just have a rule that says you shouldn't kill, right? And, in the Christian tradition, that's because that's God's job to give and take life, right? Certainly, sure, right, Freud hadn't done anything to deserve being killed, right? So in a sense, he was innocent, and Schur intentionally took an innocent life. So technically, he did murder Freud, right? So if we agree that Schur murdered Freud, and then we just have a general rule, yeah, well, murder is wrong, then Schur did something wrong, and he should be locked up and, uh, in prison for a long, long time, right? But if somewhere in your gut you feel like, well, that doesn't seem right, right? Freud asked him to. He was, in a sense, maybe doing him a favor, right? He was ending his suffering. Um, well, the traditional, right, black and white rules about murder kind of ethics is not going to give you that answer, but utilitarianism can, right? So utilitarianism, right? Again, it's act consequentialism. So we're looking at every particular action, right? We're not using general rules. We're looking at every particular action saying, is this action right or wrong? And what we do to determine whether that action is right or wrong is we look at the consequences. So what would have been the consequences if Schur did not give Freud the injection and instead let him live? He still would have died very soon, right? Between that moment and when he finally died, he would have been in terrible pain. He would have experienced very little, if any, happiness or any pleasure, right? Because he was totally isolated. So beyond the physical pain, he just couldn't get the pleasure of sort of companionship or anything like that. He was basically unable to do much of anything, right? Even reading a book is difficult. Like moving, like literally your hands to turn the pages and stuff hurts, right? And we sort of have evidence for that in the fact that Freud asked to be killed, right? If, as a normal human being, he preferred pleasure to pain, right? We can assume that if he wanted to just end his life, that was because he saw that there was more pain in his future than pleasure, right? So if we let Freud live, it seems like you add up the pain and the pleasure, there's a lot of pain and not much, if any, pleasure, right? So utilitarianism would say that's probably a wrong action to let Freud live, right? We want to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. So what about the other thing? What if we, right, kill Freud? What would the utilitarians say about that? Well, certainly you're going to reduce the amount of pain, right? If you kill him now, suppose that he would have lived another month, right, if we hadn't killed him. That's 24 hours a day of pain, right, for a whole month, right? A lot of pain. If you kill him now, none of that pain happens, right? So you wipe a lot of pain out of the ledger, right? Now, you're not really creating more pleasure for him, but there didn't seem to be any possibility of creating really any pleasure for Freud, right? So at the very least, you can reduce some of the pain in the world, right? And bring that down to zero pain, right? No pleasure, but also no pain. So instead of sort of a negative, right, which you get if you let him live, you're kind of just at zero, right? And okay, again, the utilitarian just simply does the math. Zero is greater than negative whatever pain, so we kill, right? And so this is sort of I believe it was Bentham, kind of worked out an actual sort of little utilitarian calculus system, right? That you see over on the left side, intensity, duration, certainty, uncertainty, propinquity, remoteness. That means sort of nearness or remoteness, fecundity, purity. These are all sort of ways you could rate pain and pleasure, right? Is super intense pain or super intense pleasure? How long does it last? How likely is it that pain or pleasure will occur? How far in the future, right? Will that pleasure create more pleasure, right? And so on, right? I don't quite know what he meant by purity, right? most of the time in philosophy, right, we don't actually get into this thing of adding up the numbers, but you certainly could, right? So this is sort of an example of like, an ethical dilemma you might be in, where like, oh, you've captured a terrorist, and if you torture them, they might give you an answer that could help you defuse a bomb or something like that. Whereas, and in general, torturing people is bad. That creates pain, right? But then the question is, could you prevent a lot more pain, right? And you could add up the numbers and decide whether, in this case, it's right to torture someone, right? And again, um, you might find it more useful, more intuitive to take these things case by case instead of having a general rule that says you never torture anyone ever, right? Utilitarian says sometimes it might be the best thing. Now, as we noted, utilitarianism was sort of a revolutionary kind of approach to ethics, and it was sort of in contrast with the dominant approach, which was largely religious. That doesn't necessarily mean that utilitarianism has to like conflict with religion. It's not sort of necessarily the case, even though they come from different approaches. They have different sort of fundamental conceptions of what the good is. They might end up agreeing on a lot of things. So, for example, right, with the case of euthanasia, you might think, well, God is, if God is benevolent, right, as the Christian religion and many other religions posit, then wouldn't he also be opposed to, right, his creatures or her creatures suffering for no reason? An argument could be made to that effect, right? But nonetheless, the point is still obviously controversial. Sometimes for religious reasons, people, if people do sort of hold that God has commanded only he may take life or whatever, then you're not going to be in favor of euthanasia. It's also illegal in many places, which may be a sort of a remnant of the religious past, or there may be other reasons. We'll see when we get to deontology, sort of non-religious basis for having sort of absolute rules of the sort of, don't kill people. So in general, morality and law are distinct things, right? So lying to your friends, most people would say is immoral. Typically, that's not illegal, right? If you ask me, hey, can I borrow $5? And I say, oh, I don't have any cash on me, even when I have a 5 in my wallet. That's not illegal, right? But you might say it's immoral, right, to lie in that way. So morality and law. And then some legal issues are sort of purely like maybe have nothing to do with morality, right? Building codes or something like that. But nonetheless, there is considerable overlap, right? A lot of the things that we take to be illegal, we make them illegal because we think they're immoral and people should not do them, right? In the big picture sense of should, right? And so we make them illegal to prevent people from doing them. Certainly, you want something that is moral to also be legal, right? So, like in the case of euthanasia, right? If you agree with the utilitarian that euthanasia is moral, then that has some implications for the legal system. We would like the legal system to at least allow us to do the right thing, right? Okay, so the Bentham and Mill sort of, that was the direction they took utilitarianism. They thought it could also be a legal framework, right? So any action, if it doesn't do any harm, right? There's lots of other sorts of examples. For example, there's all kinds of consensual sexual activity that is actually illegal, right? More so in the past, but even now there's laws on the books. So we discussed some on, there's laws against homosexuality still in some places. And at the time, right, there were in the 1800s, this sort of approach was pretty revolutionary, right? If you just thinking about consequences and pain and pleasure sort of shook up some of the dogmatic assumptions that people had about morality and that had been encoded in law, right? People had just sort of assumed, well, yes, of course it's wrong, right, to be gay. And then Bentham and Mill might come along and say, why are they hurting anyone, right? They're only making each other, right? Two people involved in a gay relationship are just making each other happy and they're not harming anyone else. So what's the problem, right? So at the time, very revolutionary, now a bit more commonplace. So with this in mind, right, this relationship between a utilitarian approach to morality and its implications for, right, the legal system, we can examine Rachel's second example, which is marijuana, right? U.S. policy on the legality of drugs in general, but more specifically pot, because it's like compared to heroin, it seems like we'll see there's utilitarian calculus seems to say there's not a lot of downside, right? Okay, so this here is Mr. William Bennett. He was in charge of the U.S. war on drugs throughout the 80s when that whole enterprise really started ramping up, and he was very aggressive, right? He pursued persecution for possession of drugs, right? So if you were caught with a dime bag of pot, they would come down on you as hard as possible, right? As it happens, he had a PhD in philosophy, right? And here was his, so he knew at the very least that you need reasons, right, for your policies. But this was the extent of his reasoning, right? And it's not super enlightening. He says the simple fact is that drug use is wrong, period, right? And the moral argument in the end is the most compelling argument. So this seems to be an argument for why he thinks that, right, drugs should be illegal and that they should be prosecuted harshly because they are wrong in a moral sense, right? He doesn't say much else about why he thinks it's immoral, right? So there's not a lot of argument going on there, but I guess there's a little bit, at least an argument for his legal policy, right? So we don't know exactly what his reasons are for that moral judgment, but we can explore at least what a utilitarian would say and see if they come up with a different answer. So again, utilitarians don't think anything is wrong by its very nature, right? The sorts of things that are wrong, right, are actions. Remember, hedonistic act consequentialism, right? So we're concerned with actions. What's the action, relevant action here? Smoking pot or possessing pot, buying pot, things like that, right? Let's talk about smoking pot. I think that's what Bennett was concerned with. He thought using drugs was wrong. So let's talk about using drugs, right? That's the action. So what is the utilitarian? How is the utilitarian going to judge that action as moral or immoral? They're going to look at the consequences, more specifically, how much pain is produced and how much pleasure is produced, right? So we can do that in our minds with marijuana, right? Using pot. So what are the pleasures associated with it? Well, it feels good to smoke pot, right? That's why people do it, right? So there's some inherent pleasure in that action, right? Are there any downsides? Is there any pain, right, involved? Well, if you believe some of the sort of 80s propaganda, right, you might think that marijuana use causes people to commit crimes, right, or to behave violently. If that were true, then that is a sort of behavior that is likely to cause pain, right? And so that would have to go in the right pain column. However, that claim seems to be false, right? It seems like, if anything, if you smoke pot, you're going to tend to want to watch TV or listen to music or play video games and then eat something. You're not any more likely to go out and, right, stab someone. And I mean, part of that argument traditionally was, well, even if pot doesn't cause you, right, to commit crimes or to become violent, it's a gateway drug, right? So people that use pot are more likely to then try cocaine and heroin, and then those drugs are going to cause violence down the road. Again, if that were true, well, okay, then that would be, and then if it were true that doing heroin or cocaine was more likely to cause violence, then that would have to go down in the pain column, right? But again, that empirical claim doesn't seem to be true either. It doesn't seem like smoking pot causes people to do harder drugs, right? Now, if you looked at the stats, I think you might see some sort of correlation, right? But we have to be careful about the difference between a correlation and causation, right? So it might be the case that the type of person that's going to do heroin is going to do pot too, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone or even significant portion of people who try pot will do heroin. Right? Okay. Um, but I'm not saying it's all good, right? There are downsides to marijuana use, particularly sort of like um, long-term habitual marijuana use. So people do get addicted, right? It's not as intensely physically addictive as, again, heroin or cocaine, um, but there is a degree of addiction, right? And you withdraw from it, and it's not that bad. Again, not like heroin, but not super fun. You don't feel great for like a few days. Um, if you stop smoking pot, if you've been smoking regularly for a long time, right? You will have a few days where you feel kind of funky. And that's pain, right? That counts as pain. Is that pain more greater than the amount of pleasure you got from smoking it? Maybe not, right? Um, there may be some evidence that long-term use can cause some cognitive damage. And in general, it does make you a little lazy, right? A little less motivated, um, which means you may be less likely to go accomplish things that will, right, give you pleasure, right? Certainly, it's possible that if you smoke a lot of weed, you're not going to get around to doing your homework, and you're not going to do as well on your exams, and you might not get as good grades in college. That's certainly possible, and not and right and failing college or not doing well that causes a certain amount of pain, or at least prevents a certain amount of pleasure, right, from getting where you want to go in life. So there are cons, right? Um, but it seems like most of those cons, right, that the pain created largely occurs when you're a habitual sort of heavy user, right? Um, Occasional pot use doesn't seem to have those effects. You're not going to have to worry about withdrawals. Um, you're probably not going to have to worry about it affecting your study habits and whatever significantly, right? So all that stuff certainly goes in the columns, right, when we're doing the utilitarian calculus. But it's not just sort of the individual user that we're concerned with, right? Utilitarianism cares about the effects on the entire world, right? Net pleasure and pain for the whole world. Um, so, does pot use have some sort of negative effect on the world? We consider this when we consider the propensity for violence, right? Um, are if people are gonna tend to drive while high, that could be a problem, right? That could cause traffic accidents, can cause people to be injured, that can create pain. Um, Now, there is a fair amount of crime associated with the drug trade, right? But we have to keep in mind that this is because it is currently illegal, right? So if it were legal, um, that might actually reduce a fair amount of the crime. So there's a certain amount of crime involved with people, um, right, stealing to get money to buy drugs, right? Maybe that would still happen if drugs were illegal, but all of the sort of cartels, right? Because the whole trade is sort of black market underground. Um, there's probably a lot more crime involved just in the fact of marijuana being illegal that would actually go away, right? And all the violence and pain associated with that. If marijuana were legal, probably more people would use it, right? Um, whole society as a whole might become less productive. Now we have this experiment in California because it now is legal, right? Um, I don't know that we've seen a huge drop in productivity, right? But maybe it's a long-term thing we need to observe. But even if that were true, there's some pain involved with being less productive, right? There's fewer goods out there for people to consume, people are making less money, and so on, right? And all that stuff is connected to pleasure and pain. Um, there could also be a net benefit, right? Alcohol seems to be in every way far worse than marijuana, right? Alcohol withdrawal can actually kill you, um, right? Drunk driving is clearly much more violence and just sort of injury associated with alcohol than with marijuana, right? So if marijuana were legal and someone who had wanted to try it, and the only reason they weren't was that it was illegal, um, and then if they then decided they liked it so much that they stopped drinking, that could be a net positive, right? So there's also the issue of instead of spending tax money fighting drugs, they could be bringing in tax money from selling drugs, right? Um, and all that money, as I said, a lot of that money currently goes to criminal gangs and cartels because it's illegal. So a lot of factors, right? And you're starting to get a sense that like it's really hard to calculate stuff on the utilitarian calculus. I have to think about the whole world, long-term future stuff. All of these are largely empirical questions. You need a lot of sort of data to make a good judgment. That doesn't mean it's a bad moral theory. That might even be a mark in its favor, right? If it takes into account like actual data and knowledge instead of just sort of like a rule that you can sort of apply everything to without having to sort of work very hard. The fact that you have to work hard to make a utilitarian moral decision means you're taking right the moral decision seriously. So I see that a lot in student papers. Well, someone will sometimes write a paper saying, "Well, utilitarianism's no good because it's just too hard to do the calculations. It's impossible." Well, not really. And Mill has some stuff to say about that. We'll see that when we talk about Mill. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a lot of calculations involved. So, Rachel's goes on about marijuana. Um, the upshot, at least from his discussion, there don't seem to be huge downsides to marijuana use or legalization, and there do seem to be significant upsides, right? And again, among those is just the inherent pleasure of doing the drug. Drugs are pleasurable, right? Whether or not you think on the whole they're good, that is the reason people do them, right? So probably, according to Rachel's, and I tend to agree, the utilitarian calculus would probably favor legalizing marijuana. But maybe you think they're wrong. Maybe you think they missed something important, right? You could write a paper about it. All right, our third example, again, just the practice of applying utilitarianism to significant moral questions, right? Here we have the issue of non-human animals and our actions that involve animals besides ourselves, right? Besides humans. Traditionally, right, the dominant religious doctrine was that there's a big difference between humans and animals. Humans have souls, right? They go to an afterlife after they die. Animals do not have souls. And also, animals were created by God for our use, right? So, like cows and chickens exist for us to eat them and to use their skin for leather and things like that. And so, within that framework, um, they're there for your use. You can do whatever you want to an animal, right? There's kind of no such thing as there's no real moral status, or you don't really have to think about um, whether or not the animal, right, has any moral status when you're thinking about some action that involves an animal. Um, depending in some cultures or in some religious, right, some legal systems, some religious systems, there might be moral rules against sort of needless cruelty to animals. But as often as not, those sorts of rules were more about the humans, right? In that it's just wrong for humans to be cruel in general, right? And it's sort of harmful to your soul or whatever to be cruel. And it was often less about worries about whether we need to consider right, the animals in this moral calculus, right? So nowadays, the way we view animals is pretty different, right? Sort of science and the cognitive science has shown us there's not such a clear clear-cut distinction, right, between the sort of mental faculties. Now that we're not concerned, now that for most of us, the relevant distinction is not has a soul or doesn't have a soul, right? And instead, we're thinking about, well, what kinds of minds do they have, right? Do they have a desire not to, can they feel pain? Do they have a desire not to feel pain, right? Do they have emotions and things like that? Um, that's sort of more we're concerned about. And the closer we think they might be to us, the less likely we are to want to abuse them. Right? So it does in fact seem, right, at least our best science seems to tell us that dogs, cats, lab rats, apes, and so on, surprisingly intelligent, right? Surprisingly sensitive. They do feel pain. They do have emotions, and so on. Right? Now, if you're a stickler for philosophy of mind, you might say there's some in principle impossibility in really knowing what sort of conscious states other creatures have, but at any rate, our best science says the smart money's on, yeah, dogs can feel pain and dogs have emotions and dogs can hurt if they're abused, right? Um, and so most of us would never abuse our dog, right? Or just shoot it for no, because it's whatever, inconvenient or anything like that, right? We do tend to care about our pets at the very least. But there are also a lot of animals that aren't our pets that we don't think about too much, right? You've probably, all of you at some point, become aware of sort of like what goes on in factory farming, right? The way cows and pigs and chickens and stuff are treated, and it seems pretty cruel, right? Um, and for the most part, we just kind of don't think about it, right? Maybe you find some way to justify it to yourself, or maybe you just don't worry about it. You got other stuff to worry about. But let's just take a moment, right? If you haven't before, um, maybe some of you have thought about this stuff carefully, and maybe you've decided to become vegetarians or vegans. Um, but if you haven't, let's look at it carefully from a utilitarian perspective. Um, okay, so first of all this question about whether how intelligent are animals, do they have emotions, and so on. A lot of that actually doesn't matter to the utilitarian, right? Um, the only relevant consequence is pain and pleasure. So, doesn't matter if they have a soul, doesn't matter how intelligent or rational they are. Um, it doesn't matter whether, in fact, God said that we can do whatever we want to them. Utilitarian doesn't care about any of that. They're asking, can the animals suffer? Can they feel pain? Can they feel pleasure? And if they can, right, then that matters to the utilitarian, right? And we should take it into account. There's nothing, right, in utilitarianism that says we only care about human pain and human pleasure. All the pain in the universe, right, is what we care about. We're utilitarian. So now it's not just say the cow. So we're considering, right, eating a steak, and we're thinking about, well, what sort of pain and pleasure has that cow had to go through to provide us a steak? Um, that counts. We have to add that in. But also, again, we have to consider the effects on the whole world. So there may be effects on humans as well that we have to count, right? And so again, we add it all up, and again, it's a huge undertaking, right? We're not going to actually be able to um, perfectly figure out the amount of pain and pleasure, but we do our best, right? And we see, okay, if eating that steak, right? And again, we're thinking of particular action. Should I have this steak? Should I buy a steak, right? Um, well, we think about what are the effects on the whole world, and if on net it's going to create greater pleasure for everyone, then we eat the steak. And if it's going to create more pain, then we do not. Um, there's lots of relevant images about factory farming and stuff that I could post here, but I'll spare you. It's gross. If you're unconvinced and you want to Google it, like you can spend a few minutes on YouTube looking up horrors of factory farming. I will, however, describe to you some horrors, right? So here's a few experiments, right? Again, eating meat and not is not the only way we use animals for our benefit. We also use them for medical experimentation. Um, so here are a few actual things that have been done to animals in the name of furthering our knowledge. Uh, in Maryland in 1996, science took beagles, the dogs, and they wanted to study septic shock. So they cut holes in the dogs' throats, put E. coli, the bacteria, in their stomachs, and waited to see what happens, and they died, right? So now they know that if you stick E. coli directly in a dog's stomach, they will probably die. In Taiwan in 1997, scientists wanted to study spinal injuries, right? So they dropped weights from various heights onto the spines of rats, and then turns out that um, their spines are injured more if you drop a weight from a greater height. Okay, now we know that, right? Probably could have guessed, right? And since the 1990s, chimps, monkeys, dogs, cats, and rodents have been used to study alcoholism. And typically, what they do is they give them insane amounts of alcohol, right, and then watch them sort of vomit and tremor and seize and do all these things, right? Withdrawal, where they go into convulsions, um, give them electric shocks, inject chemicals in their brains. So, um, look, some of this still goes on, right? Particularly with rats. I don't think we abuse dogs the way we used to, right? Or even monkeys as much. Um, certainly some of this, right, particularly like cancer research and things like that, there's significant benefits, right? And again, the utilitarian would say, well, yeah, if I can cause pain to one rat and cure cancer, right? It's sort of a slam dunk. Of course, that's going to be more pleasure than pain. But some of these experiments, not entirely clear, right? So, like, what exactly benefit was conferred on the world as a whole by finding out that if you drop a weight from a higher height onto a rat's spine, it causes a greater injury? Um, do we need to know that, right? Do we need to know that E. coli kills dogs? Maybe you might argue that yes, right? Again, and most of us are looking from this outside research, right? It'd be best to ask the researchers, right? What did they think they were doing? What benefit did they think they could obtain? Um, Again, like I said, if it's going to cure cancer, then sure, that seems like that's going to cause a lot more pleasure, reduce a lot of pain. But this one about just crushing rats' spines, at least from the outside, as a uninformed observer, doesn't seem maybe it would be moral. Like it's causing a lot of pain, and it's not clear what the benefit is. Um, Many of us do not have to worry. Oh, well, we are at a university, so some of you may go on to do just this sort of thing. And you may already know, right? There are sort of, if you're going to do such an experiment, you do have to sort of submit a proposal to the board that determines whether this is ethical or not, right? Um, but many of us are not going to go on to be scientists, right? So what about us? Well, we do eat meat, right? Again, you can think about veal calves as a sort of an extreme example. So whatever. I'm fairly familiar with the ethical literature, and I'm fairly familiar with the arguments, and I find them rather convincing for the most part. And yet, my behavior has not changed dramatically. I still eat meat from time to time, right? But I don't mess with veal because, man, this is the most extreme example, right, of the suffering that food animals undergo. Um, so the idea with veal is it's supposed to be very tender, right? So what they do is they take a very young calf from their mother when they're very young, and they just put them in a tiny cage so they can't move, right? They don't get any exercise as their muscles don't build up, so it's just very tender meat. Um, like they get a flea on their butt or whatever that's biting them, they can't even turn around to you know. And they're fed this very specific diet that's made to make the meat super tender, but it's not nutritionally sound at all, right? So they have deficiencies. So these calves, basically, from the moment they're taken from their mothers, which is very soon after their birth, until they are slaughtered, pretty much suffering nonstop, right? Um, that's the most extreme example. But then, again, if you want to search around and find these videos on factory farming, other animals aren't treated that much better. They're packed together, very tiny spaces, fed very weird diets, just for the sake of getting as much meat as possible very cheaply. So, final slide, right? Final example. Let's run the calculus on that. So, um, so on the pleasure side, veal is delicious, right? It would be pleasurable to eat the veal. It also will provide protein to you, right? And so you need a diet adequate in protein so as not to suffer, right, the pain involved with being protein deficient. It is going to provide a boost to the economy, right, to the veal industry. People are going to have jobs, make money, and so on. So definitely there is some pleasure involved, right? And for the utilitarian, pleasure is good, right? There's no sort of immoral pleasure. Um, it's not sinister to eat veal necessarily. It just might turn out wrong if there's more pain involved, right? So let's see if there's more pain involved. Um, Now the tricky thing here, right? So um, it's not so much that the pleasure of the meal. So say you love, right, to eat veal and you have a veal meal and you're like, oh, that's 100 points of pleasure, right? Um, that's not actually necessarily the relevant uh, number there because you have to think about, okay, it's actually sort of how much surplus pleasure over the meal you would have had, right? So you could have had a nice eggplant parmesan instead of the veal parmesan, and maybe that's like 75 points of pleasure, right? So now the question is, okay, so eating the veal instead of the eggplant, that's an extra 25 points of pleasure. And now how much pain for the veal calf, right? And again, of course, we're considering the whole world as well, right? But just for this part of it. So if it's more than 25 points of pain for the veal calf, then it seems like you're losing, right? You shouldn't be eating it. So again, a lot of complications on how we run that moral calculus, and we don't necessarily have to get into all the details of every single case here. We're simply doing that, right, to help by walking through it, give you a sense of like, okay, here's what utilitarianism is, here's what it cares about, and here's some of the sort of interesting consequences, right? If you're utilitarian, you probably would be, right, a pro pot and probably a vegetarian, right? It seems like the math works out that way. Now you could always dispute the math, but at least that's how Rachel's added up. So that certainly is, we're at 55 minutes. That's plenty of time on utilitarianism for now. The next lecture will be on some serious problems for utilitarianism. And I will see you then.